Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the star of our show, Carrie.
Hey there, theater lovers, and welcome back to another exciting episode of The Music and Me. I'm your host, Terry, and before we get started on today's episode, I just want to talk a little bit about last week's episode, which was about Dua Lipa. Now, before I did the episode about Dua Lipa, I listened to a lot of her music, and I loved her as an artist and music singer. But now I love her even more because after I did that episode, I became absolutely obsessed with Dua Lipa, and I've been watching so many videos, concert footage, any video I can find. I've been watching interviews. I just love her as a person, and I just wanted to say I'm a huge fan. So if you haven't listened to my episode about Dua Lipa, I will link it in the show notes. It's a great episode, and she is a great, great person as well as an artist. All right. That being said, let's get started with today's episode. Today, we're diving into the fascinating world of Broadway's biggest flops. So we're switching it up a little and going Broadway this week. We're going to talk about those shows that, despite all the hype, glitz, and glamour, just couldn't make it on the Great White Way. Now, I'll be honest with you, some of these flops were a surprise to me. I mean, who would have thought that a show with such high expectations and star-studded teams would end up closing its doors early? It's truly a roller coaster of emotions. And speaking of emotions, there's one particular musical on our list today that left me absolutely devastated when it was canceled because I wanted to see that one so bad. I was obsessed with it, and I know I'm not alone in that heartbreak. But it's not all doom and gloom, my friends. I love the music from a number of these shows, and we'll be celebrating those unforgettable tunes that have lived on even after the curtains have fallen. So sit back, relax, and let's explore the highs, the lows, and the unexpected twists and turns of Broadway's biggest flops. And if you enjoy this episode or my previous episodes, please share this podcast with your friends, fellow theater buffs, music lovers, anyone who loves a good behind the scenes story, anybody. I just want to spread my love of music with others and educate you along the way. All right, without further ado, let's get into the drama, the intrigue, and the music of Broadway's most infamous failures. Let's take a step back and answer the big question. What exactly makes a show a flop on Broadway? Now, I know what you're thinking. Flop sounds like such a harsh word, right? It's like calling a souffle a disaster because it didn't rise. But in the world of Broadway, a flop is just as dramatic as a collapsed dessert. We're talking about shows that, despite all the glitter, star power, and sky-high expectations, just didn't hit the mark. So what makes a show a flop? Let's break it down and have some fun while we're at it. First up, the money. Yes, the cold, hard cash. Broadway productions are like the Rolls-Royce of the theater world. Big, shiny, and oh so expensive. When producers pour millions into a show, they're banking on a packed house and a nice long run. But when those seats are emptier than a theater during the matinee of Cats on a snow day, we've got a problem. Financial loss is the most glaring sign of a flop. If the box office isn't making enough money to match the massive investment, it's curtains for that show. And believe me, the sound of a show closing before it's made its money back is the ultimate Broadway heartbreak. Now, let's talk about the critics. They can make or break a show with a single sentence. Sometimes a show hits the stage and the critics are ready to pounce with their sharpened pencils. A bad review from the New York Times? That's like getting a Broadway scarlet letter. But here's the twist. Sometimes the audience actually loves a show that the critics hate. It's a tale as old as time, critics versus audiences. One man's trash is another man's treasure, or in this case, one critic's dud is another audience's guilty pleasure. But when the critics and audiences are both yawning, or even worse, leaving at intermission, it's a sure sign of trouble. And then there's the short run time. Some shows are like a Broadway blink. You'll miss them. When a show opens with big dreams and closes within weeks or even days, you know something didn't go according to plan. Sometimes it's like a Broadway ghost, here today, gone tomorrow, and you wonder if it really happened at all. But here's where it gets really interesting. Comparing flops to other flops. It's like a Broadway fail-off. When we talk about flops, we can't help but compare the grandeur of one disaster to another. Was Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark more of a disaster than Carrie? Did Merrily We Roll Along flop harder than King Kong? The stories of these theatrical tumbles are as diverse as the shows themselves, each with its own special brand of chaos. Finally, let's take a step back and look at the historical perspective. The definition of a flop has evolved over decades, much like fashion. What was considered a flop in the 1950s might not even make the flop list today. Back in the day, a show might have closed early, but it could still develop a cult following, becoming a hidden gem in Broadway's treasure chest. Today, with the internet and social media, word of flop spreads faster than ever, and the stakes are higher. And that, my friends, is the anatomy of a Broadway flop. It's a mix of financial loss, critical reception, short run times, and a bit of history thrown in for good measure. But as we'll see, even the biggest flops can leave a lasting legacy. And sometimes, just sometimes, they come back to surprise us all. Now let's get into some of the shows that were considered flops on Broadway. Let's start with Merrily We Roll Along. If there was ever a show that defined the phrase ahead of its time, this is it. Picture it. 1981, Broadway. The legendary Stephen Sondheim and the iconic director Harold Prince join forces once again. These two had already given the world Sweeney Todd and Company, so when they announced Merrily We Roll Along, expectations were sky high. I mean, this was a dream team if there ever was one. But here's where the story takes a surprising turn, and not the kind you want in a Broadway show. Despite all the talent behind it, Merrily We Roll Along flopped harder than a souffle on a rainy day. How hard, you ask? It closed after just 16 performances. Yep, you heard that right, 16. That's barely more than 2 weeks. Talk about a blink and you'll miss it moment in theater history. So what went wrong? Well, let's start with the story itself. The show is based on a 1934 play by George S. Kaufman and Moss Hart, and it tells the story of 3 friends, Franklin, Charlie, and Mary, as they navigate the ups and downs of their careers and friendships. But here's the kicker. The story is told in reverse. We start with the characters at the end of their journey, bitter, disillusioned, and estranged. Then we roll backward to see how they got there. It's a bold concept, and while it sounds intriguing, it turned out to be more confusing than captivating for audiences at that time. The complex narrative structure left many theater goers scratching their heads. Imagine trying to keep up with a plot that's unraveling itself in reverse, all while trying to connect with characters whose relationships are also unraveling. It's no wonder that people struggled to keep up. The lack of coherence was also a big issue. Audiences just couldn't connect with the story or the characters in the way they needed to for the show to work. But here's the twist. Merrily We Roll Along didn't fade into obscurity like so many other flops. Instead, it found a second life. Over the years, the show developed a cult following. Fans began to appreciate the show's brilliant score, with songs like Not a Day Goes By and Our Time standing out as some of Sondheim's best work. And as more people revisited the show, they began to see the beauty in its complexity. In fact, Merrily We Roll Along has been revived multiple times, each time with a bit more love and appreciation. And this year, the show was back on Broadway, bringing its once flopped self into the spotlight. The 2023 revival, starring Daniel Radcliffe, Jonathan Groff, and Lindsay Mendez, not only brought the show back to life, but also earned a Tony Award nomination. Talk about a comeback story. So while Merrily We Roll Along may have started as one of Broadway's biggest flops, it's a shining example of how sometimes, just sometimes, a show needs a little more time to find its audience. And when it does, it can roll right into the hearts of theater lovers everywhere. Okay, next, let's talk about Carrie. No, not the prom queen with telekinetic powers, but the musical. Yes, you heard that right. Back in 1988, someone decided that Stephen King's horror novel with all its blood and mayhem would make a great Broadway musical. And let me tell you, expectations were sky high, maybe even higher than Carrie's prom night vengeance. So here's the scoop. Carrie the musical was one of the most hyped shows of the late 1980s. It had a pedigree to die for, no pun intended. The music was by Michael Gore, the man who gave us the tunes from Fame, and the lyrics were by Dean Pitchford, an Oscar-winning lyricist. Plus, it was based on a Stephen King novel, which had already been turned into a hit movie. What could go wrong, right? Well, as it turns out, a lot. The production was famously troubled from the get-go. Imagine this. You've got a show that's trying to blend high school drama, teenage angst, and supernatural horror into a Broadway musical. That's like trying to mix oil and water while tap dancing. There were infamous moments during previews, like when an actor's mic picked up the wrong frequency, leading to a ghostly voice calling out from the speakers. Spooky, but not in the way they intended. The tone of the show was all over the place. One minute, you're watching Carrie's mother belt out an eerie hymn, and the next, there's a full-blown disco number with high school kids in spandex. It was like Grease meets The Exorcist. The audiences just couldn't figure out what they were supposed to be feeling. Should they be scared? Should they be laughing? It was all very confusing. And then there was the infamous ending. In the climactic prom scene, instead of being a terrifying spectacle, it was more like a splash zone at a theme park. Critics were brutal, audiences were bewildered, and despite all the hype, Carrie closed after just 5 performances. 5. It barely had time to open before it was drenched in bad reviews and sent packing. But here's the twist. Carrie didn't just disappear. Over the years, it developed a cult following. People started to appreciate it for its sheer audacity, its catchy if bizarre songs, and its so bad it's good vibe. In fact, it's been revived a few times, with fans loving its campy charm and wild over-the-top drama. So while Carrie the musical may have been a disaster back in 1988, it's now a beloved part of Broadway folklore. It's proof that even the biggest flops can rise from the ashes and find their place in the spotlight. Just hopefully not under a bucket of pig's blood. Gross. The next flop on our list is one that might just have you climbing the walls. Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark. If you were following Broadway news back in 2010, you couldn't escape the web of hype surrounding the show. It had everything. A huge budget, rock legends Bono and The Edge from U2 composing the music, and the promise of bringing Spider-Man's high-flying action to the stage. It was supposed to be the ultimate theatrical spectacle. But, as we know, not every superhero story has a happy ending. Despite all the star power and excitement, Spider-Man: Turn Off the Dark ended up being more of a tangled mess than a blockbuster hit. Let's start with the massive budget. $75 million. Just think about that for a second. This was one of the most expensive shows in Broadway history, and it showed in the elaborate sets, cutting-edge special effects, and complex aerial stunts. But with great budget comes great responsibility, and that's where the trouble began. The production was notorious for its technical issues. Sets that didn't work, stunts that went wrong, and an aerial rigging system that seemed to be more intent on dropping actors than flying them across the stage. Injuries were so frequent that it felt like you were more likely to see a performer take a tumble than land in a perfect web swing. And if the physical challenges weren't enough, the story itself was a constantly shifting target. The show went through multiple rewrites, trying to strike a balance between comic book fun and rock opera drama. Unfortunately, the plot became so convoluted that it left audiences scratching their heads instead of cheering for the hero. Despite all these issues, Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark managed to limp through an excruciatingly long preview period, 183 performances to be exact, before it finally opened. But when critics came, they did not hold back. The reviews were brutal, calling the show a financial and critical disaster. Still, the show had a surprisingly long run of 3 years. It turned into something of a Broadway oddity, with people flocking to see the spectacle just to say they'd experienced the most infamous flop in theater history. So while Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark might have failed to soar, it certainly left its mark as one of the Broadway's most unforgettable and costly misadventures. Next up on our list of Broadway flops is a show that had everyone going bananas, King Kong. When you hear about a musical featuring a giant, high-tech puppet as the main attraction, you can't help but be intrigued. And believe me, this wasn't just any puppet. It was a 20-foot tall, 2,000-pound marvel of engineering that could move, roar, and even show emotion. The ambition was through the roof, and as we've learned, ambition doesn't always guarantee success. King Kong hit the Broadway stage in 2018, and the buzz was all about that massive, lifelike puppet. People were excited to see how they'd bring the iconic beast to life, and visually, the show delivered. The Kong puppet was incredible, a true spectacle that showcased some of the best stagecraft Broadway had to offer. The sheer scale of it was awe-inspiring, and it moved with a fluidity that made you forget it was operated by a team of puppeteers and animatronics. But as impressive as the visuals were, there was an elephant, or should I say gorilla, in the room. The storytelling just didn't live up to the spectacle. The plot felt thin, and the characters seemed more like props to support Kong's big moments rather than fully developed personalities we could care about. Critics were quick to point out that while the show was a feast for the eyes, it left a lot to be desired in terms of heart and narrative. The reviews were mixed, with praises for the visual effects but criticism for the weak story. Audiences marveled at Kong, but when the curtain fell, it seemed that the big guy was carrying the entire show on his massive shoulders, and that wasn't enough to keep it afloat. Financially, King Kong struggled to recoup its investment. With such high running costs, the show needed to be a massive hit to survive, but it just couldn't sustain the momentum. Despite the initial curiosity, the spectacle alone wasn't enough to keep audiences coming back, and the show ended up closing after a relatively short run. King Kong serves as a reminder that on Broadway, even the most impressive spectacle needs to be backed by a compelling story to truly connect with audiences. Otherwise, you end up with a giant puppet and not much else. All right, I have a few more shows to talk about, but first, here's my interesting fact of the week. Welcome to my interesting fact of the week. This one is about a show so short-lived that if you blinked, you'd probably missed it, unless you're one of the unfortunate few who actually saw it. I'm talking about Moose Murders from 1983, a play so legendary in its flopdom that it closed after just one performance. That's right, just one. Imagine you've worked so hard for months on a Broadway production. You've rehearsed, built sets, and poured your heart into it. Opening night arrives, and the show is such a disaster that it closes before you've even had time to change out of your costume. That's Moose Murders for you, a show that's become the gold standard for flops. So what went wrong? The play was a mystery farce set in a remote lodge, but instead of laughs or gasps, it elicited something else from the audience: bewilderment. The script was confusing, the jokes fell flat, and the plot, Well, let's just say it was about as coherent as a moose trying to navigate Times Square. The critics didn't hold back either. The New York Times called it the worst play I've ever seen on a Broadway stage. Ouch. But hey, when you're that bad, you've at least earned yourself a spot in Broadway history. Despite, or perhaps of its catastrophic debut, Moose Murders has become a kind of cult legend. It's the punchline of Broadway jokes, a quirky piece of trivia for theater buffs, and a reminder that in the world of live theater, anything can happen. And sometimes it's a complete and utter masterpiece of a disaster. So next time you think your day is going badly, just remember, at least you didn't produce Moose Murders. And now back to our episode. Welcome back, everyone. Next on our list is one of those shows that completely caught me off guard when I found out it was considered a flop. The Cher Show. I mean, we're talking about a musical dedicated to the one and only Cher, the goddess of pop. With a soundtrack full of her greatest hits, and not one, not two, but three Chers strutting their stuff on stage, how could this not be a hit? I loved the cast recording so much that I thought it was going to do great on Broadway. But alas, it seems even Cher's star power couldn't save this one. So here's the rundown. The Cher Show was a jukebox musical that told the story of Cher's life and career. And because one Cher isn't enough to capture her iconic status, the show gave us three Chers, each representing different phases of her life: babe, lady, and star. It was like a Cher supergroup on stage, complete with all the glitter, glamour, and the attitude you'd expect. The costumes were out of this world, which makes sense given they were designed by Bob Mackie, the man behind some of Cher's most legendary looks. The performances were also praised, with Stephanie J. Block even winning a Tony for her portrayal of Cher. But despite all this, the show had its struggles. Critics praised the spectacle, the costumes, the performances, the energy. But when it came to the book and the structure of the show, the reviews were less kind. The narrative jumped around in a way that felt disjointed. And while the three Chers concept was clever, it sometimes made the storytelling feel a bit clunky. The structure just didn't seem to connect with audiences in a way that it needed to. Despite the initial buzz, the Cher Show ended up closing after less than a year on Broadway. Even with the star power of Cher herself behind it and some serious talent on stage, it just couldn't overcome the narrative weaknesses and keep the audience coming back. It's one of those cases where everything seems to be in place for a smash hit: the iconic subject, a beloved soundtrack, killer costumes, but the show just didn't quite gel in the way it needed to. Still, if you love Cher, and who doesn't, the cast recording is a blast, and the show's spirit lives on in all that fabulous music. I love that cast recording. It is so good. Because Cher's music is good, so why wouldn't it be? All right, the next flop on our list is one that had all the makings of a royal disaster: Diana the Musical. Now, when you hear that there's a musical about Princess Diana, you might think it's bound to be a hit. After all, Diana was beloved around the world, and her life story is nothing short of dramatic. But somehow, Diana the Musical managed to turn this iconic tale into one of Broadway's most talked about flops. So here's the setup. Diana the Musical premiered on Broadway in 2021 and focused on the life of Princess Diana, her marriage to Prince Charles, her struggles with the royal family, and her status as the people's princess. It was a story filled with drama, emotion, and a bit of glamour. Sounds promising, right? Well, not so much. The reception was, to put it mildly, not great. Critics were quick to pounce on the musical's mishandling of its subject matter. The tone was all over the place, veering from serious drama to campy spectacle without ever finding a comfortable balance. And let's be honest, turning Diana's very real, very tragic life into a musical is no easy feat. So when the tone wobbles, the whole production feels a bit off kilter. Despite its notable intentions, Diana the Musical has met with a pretty harsh critical response. The show's Broadway run was brief, closing after just a few months. But before it took its final bow, Diana did manage to catch some attention in an unexpected way through Netflix. The show was filmed and released on the platform, giving it a second life of sorts. And while the Broadway audience might not have been sold, the Netflix release turned it into something of a guilty pleasure to watch, which I watched it. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't great. So what went wrong? Part of it was timing. Diana was up against stiff competition from other media about Princess Diana, including a hit season of The Crown and the movie Spencer. Plus, when you're dealing with such a sensitive subject, you have to be really careful with how you handle it. And Diana just didn't hit the right notes. The tone issues, the uneven storytelling, and the fact that the audiences already had other, perhaps better portrayals of Diana to compare it to, all contributed to its downfall. In the end, Diana the Musical serves as a cautionary tale. Even with a story as compelling as Princess Diana's, it's all about the execution, and this one, unfortunately, didn't quite deliver. But if you're curious, it's still on Netflix, and it's definitely an interesting watch, if only to see what all the fuss was about. And like I said, I did watch it a while ago. I might have to watch it again just to refresh my memory about if I liked it or not. I mean, I remember it being not that bad, but not great, not my favorite, which is why I probably forgot about it. Next on our list is a show that, like a mischievous ghost, had a bit of an eerie rise and fall, Beetlejuice. If you're a fan of the cast recording like I am, this one might come as a shocker, as it did to me. With its quirky, fun score and a cast that brought the beloved Tim Burton film to life, you'd think Beetlejuice was destined for Broadway glory. But the journey was more of a wild ride than a smooth sailing. Let's start at the beginning. Beetlejuice debuted in 2019, and despite the excitement surrounding it, the show struggled to find its footing. Initially, it didn't quite hit the mark with critics or audiences. The production had its share of issues, including some controversy over moving theaters. Yeah, imagine trying to set up shop somewhere else in mid-run. And let's not forget the reception was mixed, with some loving the offbeat humor and others finding it a bit too much. But then, enter social media, the ghostly hand that lifted Beetlejuice from obscurity. Fans on Twitter and TikTok started buzzing about the show, and it wasn't long before the musical found a new audience who adored its campy charm and catchy songs. The social media buzz was like a spell that breathed new life into the show, drawing in crowds who were eager to see what all the fuss was about. The show's revival in 2022 was a testament to its newfound popularity, but the roller coaster ride wasn't over yet. Despite its success in the social media sphere, Beetlejuice faced ongoing challenges and closed its doors after its 2022 revival. It was a dramatic up and down experience, reflecting the unpredictable nature of Broadway. So what can we learn from Beetlejuice's wild journey? It's a reminder that social media can work wonders, but it doesn't always guarantee a long-lasting run. The show's quirky cult favorite appeal didn't quite align with traditional Broadway dynamics, where longevity often depends on a more stable audience base. In the end, Beetlejuice is a fascinating example of how a show can be resurrected by the power of online buzz, only to face its own set of challenges. If you haven't heard the cast recording yet, I highly recommend giving it a listen. It is so good, and it's a fun reminder of the show's offbeat charm, even if its Broadway journey was a bit of a ghost story. Okay, finally, we come to the show that hit me right in the heart when it closed. Bad Cinderella. I mean, it still hurts that Bad Cinderella closed. Where do I begin with this one? I was totally obsessed with it. I mean, I bought a ton of merchandise. I've got the poster proudly hanging on my wall. I followed every bit of news on social media, and YouTube was my go to for any snippet or behind the scenes footage I could find. I was absolutely enchanted by Andrew Lloyd Webber's reimagining of the classic Cinderella story. So when it closed, it felt like a fairy tale ending gone terribly wrong. Here's the scoop. Bad Cinderella was Andrew Lloyd Webber's latest attempt to put a fresh spin on the Cinderella tale. And if you know anything about Webber, you know he doesn't just do things by halves. The show promised a modern twist with a sharp contemporary edge to the classic fairy tale. The anticipation was high, and I was right there with everyone, excited to see what the maestro had in store. But despite the grand expectations, the reception was less than magical. Critics didn't hold back, and the show received a fair amount of panning. The concept was bold and ambitious, but it seemed to miss the mark with audiences. It closed after just 4 months, which is a blink of an eye in Broadway terms. It was a significant flop, and I was absolutely devastated and still am devastated. I'm hoping for a revival someday, maybe, hopefully. And I wish they would have got a cast recording in because the songs were great. So what went wrong? For one, there was a clear misalignment between the show's modern twist and audience expectations. People were looking for something fresh, but perhaps they weren't ready for Webber's particular brand of reimagining. The marketing also faced issues. Despite all the hype and my own fervent support, the show struggled to connect with a wider audience. It seems that the bold reinvention, while exciting to some, didn't quite resonate in the way that was hoped. In the end, Bad Cinderella remains a bittersweet memory for me. I loved it so much, and it's a reminder that even the most anticipated shows can sometimes stumble. But hey, I've still got the merchandise and the poster, and that's something I can hold on to as a token of my brief but intense affair with a show that was truly enchanting, even if it didn't get its happy ending. By the way, I'm wearing my Bad Cinderella hat. I have a Bad Cinderella ball cap. I have the Bad Cinderella bucket hat, which I'm wearing right now. As I said, I have the poster on my wall. I also bought a Bad Cinderella mug. I mean, I went all out when they said this is the last chance you're going to get some merchandise. And if you know me, you know I can't resist merchandise for anything of my favorite artists, shows, whatever. I must have stuff. So we've covered the rise and fall of some of Broadway's biggest flops. But let's talk about something truly fascinating. The legacy of these shows. Because here's the thing. Sometimes a flop isn't the end of the story. In fact, it can be just the beginning of a whole new chapter. Believe it or not, some shows that flopped spectacularly become beloved cult classics over time. Take Carrie, for instance. Despite its initial disaster, it has become a kind of campy treasure, cherished by fans who revel in its over-the-top spectacle and melodrama. Or look at Merrily We Roll Along, a show that initially baffled audiences with its non-linear storytelling, but has since gained a loyal following who appreciate its innovative approach and beautiful score. It's like finding an old movie that didn't do well at the box office, but becomes a favorite with a dedicated fan base. Sometimes being a flop is just the start of a whole new kind of success. Now, let's chat about how flops affect the people behind the scenes. For many, a flop can be a tough blow, but it's not the end of the world. It can be a learning experience or a stepping stone to future successes. Sometimes being involved in a flop can even become a badge of honor. For instance, many talented individuals involved in flops go on to create or star in major hits, using their experience to fuel their next projects. A flop doesn't necessarily define a career, it can be just part of the journey. The real magic happens when a flop finds success in unexpected ways. Take the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Originally a box office dud, it later became a cult phenomenon with audiences flocking to midnight screenings and singing along. Similarly, Little Shop of Horrors started as a flop, but eventually became a beloved film and a staple in musical theater. And remember Bad Cinderella? My beloved Bad Cinderella? While it closed quickly, who knows? It might find new life in a future revival or adaptation. I so hope so. That would make me so happy. Sometimes flops get a second chance to shine in a different form or with a new audience. So while the curtain might fall on some shows sooner than expected, their stories don't always end there. Broadway flops have a knack for surprising us with their lasting impact, unexpected second acts, and enduring fan love. It's a testament to the ever-evolving world of theater, where even the biggest disappointments can sometimes turn into the most beloved successes. And there you have it, the legacy of Broadway flops, full of twists, turns, and the occasional happy ending. Remember, in the world of theater, every flop has the potential to become something extraordinary in its own right. As we wrap up today's roller coaster ride through Broadway's biggest flops, let's take a moment to reflect on the unpredictable world of theater. Broadway is a stage where even the most dazzling stars can stumble, and where the best laid plans go awry. It's a place where creativity runs wild and where risks, both glorious and disastrous, are part of the adventure. Every flop is a reminder that even in the high-stakes world of theater, not everything can be a hit. But let's not forget the beauty of it all. The creative risks that lead to flops are also what keep Broadway exciting and ever-evolving. Each flop is a chapter in the broader Broadway landscape, showing us that even when a show doesn't succeed, it still contributes to the rich tapestry of theater. Don't forget to tune in next week for my newest episode because it's going to be so much fun. We're diving into the world of one-hit wonders. You know, those unforgettable tunes that captured the spotlight for a brief moment before vanishing into musical history. It's going to be a fun and nostalgic journey, and I can't wait to share it with you. Before we go, I want to thank everyone for tuning in to The Music in Me. Your support means the world to me, and don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and follow me on social media to stay updated on all our latest episodes. I will link all that information in the show notes. And until next time, keep the music in you alive, and remember, every great hit has its own story, even if it doesn't always end up on a high note. Peace out, everybody. This has been the Music in Me podcast. Subscribe now so you don't miss a beat.